Joseph McGill is preserving the Low Country's unheard history through his respected and notable slave dwelling project. I talk one-on-one with Joseph for this edition of Quintin's Close-Ups. And if you haven't already, subscribe to my YouTube channel and like Quintin's Close-Ups on Facebook. Joseph McGill, welcome to the award-winning Quintin's Close-Ups.
Oh yes, thank you. I'm thrilled to be here.
Yes, sir. Well, you are very legendary in this town because obviously you are the founder of the Slave Dwelling Project Incorporation and was previously a field officer for the National Trust for Historic Preservation. You are also the founder of the company I-54 Massachusetts Reenactment Regiment in Charleston. Actually, the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry was the regiment portrayed in the award-winning movie Glory. How do you describe Joseph, obviously, you do these days?
Well, I'm here. I'm still doing what I do. I still do what I do in honor of the enslaved ancestors. I do my best to give them a voice through the Slave Dwelling Project. Slave Dwelling Project is a very simple concept, finding slave dwellings wherever they are in these United States and asking the stewards if I can spend the night in these spaces in an attempt to bring attention to these spaces, because there was a period in our history where this element of architecture was ignored, although it was there all the time. But the few that are there are just that, they're few. There was this effort to get rid of the bulk of them, an effort to erase that particular part of our history, and by eliminating the buildings where enslaved ancestors once dwelled is an easy way to do that. So 11 years ago, the Slave Dwelling Project started right here in Charleston, South Carolina, at the place now of where I'm employed on a full-time basis, Magnolia Plantation and Gardens. I had my first sleepover in May at Magnolia. I woke up on Mother's Day of 2010 and thought about mothers who gave birth as enslaved women, and the laws of that period made that child a product of her enslaver. So I thought about them, and I took a walk to the cemetery there at Magnolia Plantation, and I saw the place where the enslaved people were buried in unmarked graves. You got to look for indentions in the earth that's indicative of if they were buried in a wooden box. If they were buried in a wooden box, eventually it's going to give way, and the earth itself is going to conform accordingly. So you look for those indentions in the earth, and I saw those indentions in the earth, and I knew it was for that reason that I was about to go on this journey called the Slave Dwelling Project, sleeping in slave dwellings all across the United States. And 11 years later and 25 states later, I'm still at it.
And what is the biggest difference between 2010 and right now when you think of the Slave Dwelling Project?
The biggest difference is, 11 years ago, it was Joe McGill pleading the case of the ancestors, asking these owners of these places to buy in on this crazy idea of wanting to come over to your property and spend the night in a slave dwelling. Because if you're on the other end of that phone call, you've got to wonder, what is this guy's intent? Is he about reparations? That's a fearful word. It was fearful then. It's fearful now. Is he about reparations? Is he looking for ghosts? Is he hunting treasures? Well, it's none of the above. I had to explain all that stuff away in these requests that I was making to these stewards, and I had to convince them that it was all about attention, bringing attention to the places, and because when we bring attention to the places, they'll know that they're there, and then if we can highlight the places, then we can highlight the people who inhabited those spaces, and now that's taking on more of a meaning, more so than the physical place itself. But it has to start with saving the place, because when the places are gone, it's much easier to deny the presence of the people who live there. Now, fast forward to 2011, it's not me pleading the case anymore. It's people calling the slave dwelling project. Now, we are, a nonprofit
Right.
organization, 501c3. So through the various means, through the through what we've built up, 25 states and the District of Columbia, spending nights in over 150 or so slave dwellings. It's now the potential clients calling the slave dwelling project, wanting to get on the ticket.
And who exactly are those stewards?
They vary. One 11 years ago, I had slavery in a box. I had slavery on a plantation in a southern state, and it
Mm.
certainly belonged there because it did take a civil war and the 13th Amendment to end slavery on that southern plantation in that southern state. But it limited where slavery existed. It limited the footprint in my mind of where slavery was, because even thinking in that manner, and I missed the urban slavery that was going on in Charleston, South Carolina itself. All those nice, beautiful historic buildings, those antebellum buildings that are marketed to the potential tourists that come here. All those buildings exist because of stolen labor, but that's not interpreted in that's not marketed, that's not interpreted, even when some would get here. Now we're doing a better job. I gotta give credit where credit is due, but if one were to come here 10, 20 years ago, there a possibility of hearing that element of the story, all the embodied slave labor in these places, in these nice, beautiful antebellum buildings. If that building is made of wood, well, who cut down those trees? Who made that wood what it was to build that house? If that house is made of bricks, who made those bricks? Whose labor was stolen for that building to exist? And if you look at the tax records of these folks who enslaved the people, do they pull out the element of the number of people that they enslaved? Do they interpret those letters that are in their archival inventory to see where they talked about an enslaved person, having to sell an enslaved person, or having to discipline an enslaved person? You pull out those names of all these records that exist and tell the stories of the enslaved. So it's gotten easier, and people are including all elements of the story, but there still are those who want to still deny. We're going to bring them along. We would prefer to bring them along peacefully and not kicking and screaming. But if you got to put them out on Front Street, then so be it.
I'm looking at a couple of buildings right here in downtown Charleston, which are very iconic right now. As I sit here on St. Philip Street, when it comes to urban slavery, what is still being denied?
Well, if you were to take a carriage tour, a walking tour, I'm sure every guide giving that tour would talk about what's right there in front of them. That's that nice, beautiful building facing the street. That architecturally significant building, and they're going to talk about it, and they should. But if that's an antebellum building, they need to, if they can, peer as much as they can and through that gate that exists. I'm not asking anybody to break any rules and trespass on anybody's property. But if you got a number that says, you got a whole number, and then and it's followed by a half,
Right.
focus on that half, because right behind that house is where the enslaved people inhabited. If you can walk through an alley and into the back of these houses and see how they all once upon a time had slave dwellings attached to them, and they're still there. And they're used for various things, rental spaces or whatever, man caves or she sheds, whatever they're used for, they're still there. Talk about those. Include that in your story. And if you do that, you're enriching your tour. You're telling the whole story, not that sugar coated, watered down, gone with the wind version of history that a lot of people come to, certainly to these plantations to see. and also, to Charleston to see the gentry and how they lived. Well, tell that story, but tell the stories of who they whose labor they stole to be able to achieve all that.
And when you go back into history, what was that stolen labor when it came to urban slavery around here in Charleston?
Well, that stolen labor there. Some people in the city of Charleston, they own people just for the purpose of renting them out. That was their income, renting people. Um, and so in doing that, they ensured that these people had the skills necessary to be rented out. Um, Now, the thing about that, you will hear some tour guides putting a positive twist on that, and they'll state that, well, the enslaved in the city had the opportunity to be rented out. That's not a false statement. It's a half truth, really. But you gotta also tell the rest of the story. The rest of the story is this: if you own people for the purpose of renting them out, and you give that person the opportunity to buy his or her freedom, then you're going to also ensure that that person is training somebody to replace him or her, because that's a form of your income. And you are in a mindset that you're doing this person a favor, or something that might get you into heaven, because you're giving this opportunity to buy their own freedom from you because you own them. So, um, if we incorporate all that element into the story, I think again it'll be more enriching. It'll be more of a narrative that's inclusive of all those voices that have been left out of history, and it'll show some agency. That same person who had those skills to buy his freedom, and or the freedom of his family, had some agency. He had some control within that peculiar institution.
What was the income back then?
Well, I know that an enslaved person
Mm,
leading uh, into the Civil War,
right.
right around 1860, the average price was about $600. Now, today, in today's dollars, that's a car. But the thing is, the enslavers didn't have to buy them outright; they can mortgage them. You see, that's because the banks were in it, the insurance companies were in it. Um, I get a lot of pushback when I tell people what I do, and I tell them, I've been to 25 states and the District of Columbia, and 8 of those states have been northern states. And I get the pushback from the northerners because, they are where a lot of them are where I was 11 years ago when I kept slavery in a plantation in a southern state. Well, they want to keep it there, but they don't want to deal with the fact that up until the Revolution, all those northern states, certainly the 13 colonies and all those places that had populations back then, large populations of people, they enslaved people too. Um, and even after the Revolution, uh, when they started legislatively emancipating the people within their boundaries, they were still complicit because they still owned the banks, the insurance companies, the ships bringing them in, and the factories that were adding value to the cotton that was being grown. So that's why I get pushback. I let them own the fact that they can talk about the revolution. They can talk about the Underground Railroad. They can talk about sending the army down south to actually free the enslaved people. But they have to also talk about the fact that those northern states themselves once enslaved people.
And what particular northern states surprises you to this day?
Yeah. Well, they all do, but some that stand out. You know, take New York. New York abolished slavery in 1799 on paper, but it was gradual. Last person freed in New York was 1827. And in 1703, 40% of New Yorkers were slave owners. So, in other words, more people owned less. But that's in comparison to leading up to the Civil War. There were 4.5 million people enslaved in southern states, but there was only 3% of the population that owned them. So that's kind of an inverse of the way it was going in New York. But in New York, I've stayed at Shelter Island, Long
Right.
Island, Rye, and New Paltz. New Jersey is an
Right.
interesting case. New Jersey abolished slavery in 1804, but when the Civil War started, people were still enslaved in New Jersey. So some of the last people freed in northern states were in New Jersey because it took the Civil War and the 13th Amendment to finish the process in the state of New Jersey. So yeah, and I've also been out in some states in the Midwest. I've been to Minnesota and in Wisconsin.
Right.
I stayed places there. Minnesota was interesting because I stayed at Fort Snelling.
Oh, yes.
The Dred Scott case is related to that. It was because Dred Scott was there, owned by an army medic that was stationed at Fort Snelling. You know, that period in history when we were purging natives.
Right.
We sent those army officers out there to wage that campaign. Some of those army officers were Southern men who were paid money to hire someone to take care of their personal needs, be their body servants, be their hired person to do those things. But they didn't hire a person; they enslaved the person. And Dred Scott was that in that category when he was in the state of Minnesota, and because he was in this free state, this free territory, this place that was proclaimed itself as free, he took his case to the Supreme Court, the Dred Scott case, and he lost. But anyway, I went to Minnesota and I spent the night at Fort Snelling in the space where Dred Scott would have slept with his wife, in that space because she was part of the case also, petitioning for her freedom.
Wow. Amazing. Now, the Slave Dwelling Project envisions a future in which the hearts and minds of Americans acknowledge a more truthful and inclusive narrative, as you just mentioned, of the history of the nation and honors the contributions of all of our people, is embedded and preserved in the buildings and artifacts of people of African heritage, and inspires all Americans to acknowledge their ancestors. When did you acknowledge your ancestors?
Well, I think somebody acknowledged them for me, because that's a tedious job. As far as the genealogical portion of defining and finding acknowledging my ancestors, there are those who diligently on paper, do this kind of work to make these family trees and make these connections and just show you where your family origin lies.
Right.
I don't do that. I don't have that kind of patience. I admire genealogists to people who do that. Well, somebody did it for me to back to 1890.
Wow.
So I'm going to have to get that other patient person who would do it at a minimal to zero cost and just take it back from there. Because I right now I got I have what I have. I don't have the person in my family right now inspired enough to take what I have and take ownership of it. Every family needs that genealogist. You only need one, but right now I haven't identified that person in my family. Right now, my daughter is busy with vet school, so I don't want to lay that on her, because, as I said, this thing can consume you. So I'm just looking for that right person in the family to take it on.
And I want to go back to what you talked about, obviously, with the Welling Scott case up in Minnesota. What were those personal services that most of the people in the South needed? back then.
Well, you take enslaved people and the way it worked on the plantations. You in the plantation setting, of
Mm,
course, you have your field hands.
right.
They pretty much are working in the fields, and then you got the people working in the house. You got your cook, you got your butler, you got your coachman. Uh, and some might be given jobs as stewards or whatever. Butler, steward, same, pretty much same thing. But sometimes you get an older population of white folks who get infirmed, who need a whole lot more attention on a continual basis. So you got people assigned to do that. There was this one case I was told about in Clemson University, in what is now the Calhoun Mansion that sits on that campus.
Right.
There was a system where the older person was infirmed or suffering from some malady of some sort. Well, the person, the enslaved person responsible for her, slept on a pallet right outside the door, and attached to her wrist was a string, and at the other end of that string, under the door, and then in the bed was the person that she had to serve. So when that person needed her to come in there, this is in the dead of night when both of them should be asleep. So if this person should wake up and need something, that she yanks on that string, and of course that's to alert the enslaved person to come in and take care of that person's need. Now, some of them went a little further than that. They just made a pallet for that enslaved person, at the foot of their bed or right beside their bed or something. But they had their various systems of alerting these enslaved people. Some of those houses were designed with a bell system, really. The bell system would be in the places where the enslaved would congregate or be, and they would make different tones for the enslaved person that they want to come up and service them at the time. Bring them food. There's a tone. Come empty this chamber pot. That's a tone. So there are those type needs.
And what exactly are those legacies of slavery?
Well, the legacies of slavery is good and bad.
Mm,
The fact, the goods of it is, of course, as I look on the screen, we're the goods. That's that. I have to attest to that. But if you look at the way that the system was designed to work, it was chattel. It was chattel. Not only were you enslaved, but your children and your children's children would be enslaved. So as long as you were enslaved, that's giving that enslaver the opportunity to accumulate wealth. The wealth, some of that wealth which belongs to you. Um, but you're not. The system prevents you from accumulating any wealth. So now freedom comes, but the opportunity for the enslaver to still accumulate wealth is still existing, whereas systems are being put in place to continue to disenfranchise you. Convict labor and KKK and lynchings and the redlining, that I often talk about in my presentation. All those those continue to persist to keep you at a deficit. So those are those legacies of that system that's still here.
and what is that deficit that we don't know about?
Well, that's that accumulated wealth. That accumulated wealth. There's still a lot of money I'm sorry. There's still a lot of old money that still exists. Today, a lot of old money in the form of being able to own land, accumulate land, and being able to build wealth. A lot of that wealth was built on the fact that this country benefited from free labor. Um, in that free labor is in some of this infrastructure that still exists today. That very Capitol building that was stormed on January 6th, there was a lot of free labor involved in building, in building that building. So in this divide that we're in, it has roots in the system of chattel slavery. In this that chattel slavery, that thought process that still allows this wealth gap to persist. And when the wealth gap persists, then that system that created it persists. That system of white supremacy, that system of white privilege, persists in this system, this thought process that started this nation.
And what are those other roots?
Yeah, well, if you look at the documents that prop us up as a nation, and look at who created those documents. If we go back to the Declaration of Independence, us seeking our independence from England. In that Declaration of Independence, I think the most quoted part of that is, all men are created equal. And Thomas Jefferson is often given credit for writing those lines. Well, Thomas Jefferson enslaved 600 people over the period of time that he enslaved people. Not to mention the Sally Hemings story that we had to bring out the genealogist and the DNA to prove what was always being denied about his relationship to Sally Hemings. So if we look at that Declaration of Independence and know that many of those men who signed that Declaration of Independence were slave owners. You look at the document, the Constitution. All men are created equal. Well, it should have read all men, comma, in this room are created equal, because that applied to white men who own property. And it had to be amended many times to include me, and many more times to include women. So there's the history, there's the root. There's that system, there's that legacy that we're still, that thought process, that mentality that still persists today. It lies in the intent of the people who created this nation. Also, even before all that was going on, you got to take into account the idea of colonization. Just disregarding the population who's here, the indigenous population who's here, and removing them, and waging war against them, and making them in the minds of the people, not only of then, but in my time period, and still is, making them the enemy, or proclaiming or painting them as the enemy, and leading the the indulgers of this history, the people who take in this history, making them think that the indigenous people were the bad ones. Our history is rooted in this false narrative.
What is your thought process, and I'm probably going off topic now, about gentrification?
Well, gentrification is back to colonizing. That's early gentrification. It's about identifying. It's also redlining. Draw a line around this place. If the people that you desire to be in there are still in there, find the ways of getting them out. Take the Hilton Head Island example. Once upon a time, you could find a lot of people who look like us on Hilton Head. Or you can apply the same to some of these other islands around here, Kiowa, or
Sullivan's.
Sullivan's. Yeah, you can apply the same thought process to all those places. Once upon a time, that land was undesirable because there was no air conditioning, there were no bridges connecting these places. Now it's prime beachfront beachfront property. But what that does is the population of people who once were there abundantly, who connect us mostly to our Africanism, our Gullah culture, um, they were there in abundance until those things happen, air conditioning, bridges connecting these places, and you can still find, pockets of that culture that still thrive, in better than in other places. You go to your St. Helena Island, uh, places where I've never been to Sandy Island, but I've heard good things that, our culture is thriving well there. That Gullah culture is thriving well there, and I think it should. They're a good case that one should study. There was this effort once upon a time to bring a bridge over there, and somebody defeated that effort. I think that's a good thing. Um, but yeah, gentrification, it lives. It's alive and well. You take Charleston, a good example. Once upon a time, that east side there, you could see a whole lot more of us. But every time I come into the city at least once a month, if not more. I see all this new development, and as I look at the news, I see where, something else has been approved, and it's right where, I just knew, a high concentration of African Americans used to be. They're being gentrified, they're being purged, but that's the American way. Development takes the path of least resistance. Once upon a time, that effort came by, the end of a musket. That was that colonial method of gentrification. Colonizers. Um, and now it comes in the form of laws that they put in place, redlining, and things of this nature. The tax codes that are in place, going back to Hilton Head, and knowing that, once upon a time there used to be a lot of heirs property, meaning that there are a lot of members of one family owning property, owning portions of it, and sometimes that's not even written. It's just the fact that you're in the family, your blood, and you're entitled to, a portion of that land. Well, sometimes you want to you sell your portion. But if you sell your portion of that land, then whoever bought that land is going to, he has the right. He has the right to put something on that land, build something on that land. When he builds something on that land, whatever the value of whatever he builds on that land increases the value, the land next to it. It raises the taxes, and sometimes these other members of these holders of these properties can't afford that, so they have to give it up sometimes by default. Or something of that nature. So that's another form of that gentrification, how it works. There was also this thing called urban renewal, where these larger cities were, under the guise of trying to beautify the city. They would tear down these dilapidated, or these unsightly, was more of a term that they used, neighborhoods, and a lot of times these were where the black folks live. Now, if you follow the interstate, wherever these interstates, go through these major cities, you can almost always find a path of where black neighborhoods used to be. So, that's all a part of, gentrifying us and relegating us to places, where they draw a line around us, and just kind of keep us in those places. So gentrification is not a new thing. One time it was called colonization. So now this is kind of the new way of doing it.
Joseph McGill, thank you so much for your time. And again, welcome to the award-winning Quintin's Close-Ups.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.